Does your barbarian build look like a tank but hits like a wet napkin?
Oh!
No longer, I have the best barbarian build after all the nerfs. This build is extremely strong and right up there with every other in-game class. I'm going to go over every single thing you need for this barbarian leveling guide to show you why even at lower levels this class absolutely slaps. So we're going to get right into the skills first of all. So the first primary skill you're going to want to jump into is lunging strike as your basic skill. This essentially allows you to click and hold and lock onto an enemy so they can't run away from you. You can hawk them down like a missile. It's great. Additionally, when you spec into enhanced lunging strike and battle lunging strike, you get the bleed damage effects here, and you also get additional damage that heals you for maximum life, which gives you a solid healing ability when just doing your regular attack. So once you put 1 point here and branch to these two options, you're then going to come down here to your core skills, and we're going to stack in Whirlwind. Now, you're going to want to put 5 out of 5 points eventually in Whirlwind to max it out. And even though there has been a Barbarian nerf, Whirlwind is still one of the most powerful skills in the game. Don't let anybody tell you different. The nerfs were to a lot of the shouts, but this is still a very valuable skill, as well as the shouts themselves. So Whirlwind is going to do damage, obviously, to everyone around us. And once you spec into Enhanced Whirlwind, you gain Fury, which is great for Fury regeneration. This build will be based on using Fury and building it up infinitely over and over and over again, using shouts and Whirlwind to stack it almost infinitely. Additionally, we're going to spec into Furious Whirlwind, which will give us 40% of its base damage as bleed damage, combining with the normal battle lunging strike to give us an overall solid amount of bleed damage on this build. And then at some point, you're going to want to put 3 out of 3 points in Pressure Point. If you're early level, you don't have to worry about this. As you get higher level, make sure you put 3 points here because it's going to allow your core skills to get that 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. So it's almost guaranteed to make enemies vulnerable all of the time. You're then going to want to jump down in here to your defensive skills. So there's 2 defensive skills you're going to want to grab in particular. First is going to be Rallying Cry. This is going to want to be the very earliest skill you get. That's a defensive skill. This is going to increase our movement speed by 30%, which as a barbarian is a great quality of life skill just by itself because you can cast this running around the map before you get your horse. It allows you to move a lot quicker and do a lot more things faster. So the big other thing and benefit we get from Rallying Cry that we can stack is resource generation by 56% for 7.4 seconds. But this gives us a huge boost to resource regeneration for our actual Fury meter, which obviously is down here. So that way it allows us to go ahead and stack more Fury on top of that. So we get the Fury gains back from Whirlwind every time we damage an enemy or an elite enemy. And then also if we're using Whirlwind while we're using Rallying Cry, we're getting that 56% bonus Fury on top of that. Rallying Cry will be a skill you use constantly in every single fight that you come into that you can use it for. And we're going to go into Enhanced Rallying Cry as well to make you unstoppable, removing all control impairing effects, and Tactical Rallying Cry, which generates 20 Fury every single time you use this skill and gives you an extra 20% resource generation, meaning we're getting 76% bonus Fury here. Next, we're going to go into Challenging Shout. So Challenging Shout is going to taunt nearby enemies, and you're going to get 44% damage reduction. So this is definitely good, especially in later tiers of the game when you increase difficulties, either to Veteran or Nightmare and so on, because it's going to give us a damage reduction for a solid amount of time, making us a lot more tanky and a lot more able to withstand a lot of attacks. You're then going to want to go into Enhanced Challenging Shout, which gives us 20% bonus maximum life on top of that, making us even more tanky. And then while Challenging Shout is active, when you go into Tactical, you're going to gain 3 Fury each time you take damage. So this is going to be a skill when you're gathering enemies up and you finally are able to use Whirlwind on a big group of enemies. You're going to want to cast Rallying Cry to get the bonuses for resource generation and movement speed, and Challenging Shout, so that way you can get, again, that additional Fury gain as well as the damage reduction on top of that. Then we'll come down here to Brawling Skills. There are a decent amount of passives we want to jump into, but the primary skill here that you're going to want to grab pretty early on is War Cry. This is not the best skill in the game, but it's very good going along with the shout based kind of build to maximize our damage. It gives you additional damage dealt by 15% for 7.5 seconds. Again, the same with a lot of these other shouts. If you then spec into Enhanced War Cry, you get Berserking for 4 seconds, which gives you increased damage and movement speed. And then Power War Cry, which means if at least 6 enemies are around you when you cast it, you get an additional 10% damage bonus. So right here you get 35% damage bonus automatically because of the Berserking and the Power War Cry, which obviously we're going to have a lot of enemies around when we use Whirlwind. And then you get the additional damage dealt of 15% here. That's like 40 to 50% extra damage automatically just from casting this one thing. So you want to put just 1 point here and expand down. Additionally, the passives we want here are Booming Voice. This increases your shout skill durations by 24% with 3 points in it, which is great because we essentially have 4 shouts in this build, which means we're getting benefit to all those. And Raid Leader, which means your shouts also heal allies for 3% of their maximum life per second while they're active, so you get a bunch of healing to you and your teammates for just using your skills normally. So we want to have all 3 points here. We then want to get 1 point in aggressive resistance, which means we gain some damage reduction, but we want that as a stepping stone to get to prolific fury. You want to have 3 points out of 3 points here, meaning while you're berserking, fury generation is increased by 18%. So we're going to use this shout a lot of times when we are in big fights or big groups of battles, and then we'll just get extra fury generation with this skill right here. We're then going to jump down to the weapon mastery skills. You don't want necessarily any skills here. Now while you're leveling, you could use Death Blow, and also while you're leveling, you could swap one of these other skills out from Whirlwind to Rend and kind of do that while you're leveling at lower levels, because Whirlwind doesn't do that much damage right off the bat. However, I did level with Whirlwind all the way through to level 50, so I don't think that should be a problem. But as far as weapon mastery skills, we just want to grab a couple of these passives, being Pit Fighter, meaning you deal 9% increased damage to close enemies and 6% distant damage reduction, and then this 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. And this is important because all enemies at all times basically are going to have one of these effects and are almost always going to be slowed. And this is primarily due to the hamstring skill. The hamstring skill is going to make your bleeding effects slow enemies by 10%. So we're always going to be putting bleed on enemies. And because of this, we're always going to be putting slow on enemies. So we get the additional bonus here of critical strike chance against every single enemy because of this slow on enemies. Not to mention, a lot of weapons, as you can see here, will have different kinds of benefits damage wise, and a lot of different barbarian weapons will have damage to stunned or slowed enemies. So this gives us an additional damage boost on top of that, because a lot of these weapons already have these skills on them already. So with just 1 point in hamstring, we're then going to jump down to our ultimate skills, which is going to be 1 skill and a passive. So firstly, the last skill we're going to need, which is very, very important, and being it's our ultimate skill and one of our heavy hitters, is going to be Wrath of the Berserker. Now this knocks back enemies, and you gain berserking and unstoppable for 5 seconds. And for the next 10 seconds, if you deal damage with basic skills, you get berserking again, all over again. This is important because you get a ton of increased damage. And additionally, you're going to want to grab Prime Wrath of the Berserker and Supreme Wrath of the Berserker, and those are obviously important because once Wrath of the Berserker is active, you gain 20% movement speed and you get Fury regeneration on top of the immense Fury regeneration we already have in this build, just making it sure you almost never run out of Fury. And then Supreme Wrath of the Berserker, which means while Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increases the Berserk's bonus damage by 25%, and we will essentially be spending 50 Fury every single second, meaning every second this is active, 25% damage bonus, 25% damage bonus, 25% damage bonus, over and over and over again until this is up. And you will get a ton of damage stack here, which is super, super good against high level bosses, groups of enemies, and allows you to just mow through groups of enemies and bosses this way. Now, while I was leveling, I went through Call of the Ancients because it allows you to do a bunch of damage when the skill is active, specifically around bosses, and it can save you in boss fights. So while you're leveling, I would recommend using Call of the Ancients. Additionally, if you can swing it 3 points in heavy handed, is a great skill to have because it makes it so when you're using 200 weapons, you deal 15% increased critical strike damage. Again, just another damage buff to have. So additionally, one more thing you want to do that I just haven't done right this second is stack 1 point in Tempered Fury and then use that to get to Invigorating Fury. This is going to heal you for 3% of your maximum life for every 100 Fury that you spend. And if you're spending 50 or so every single second, that means every 2 seconds you're going to heal 3%. And then finally, our primary skill is going to be Unbridled Rage, and this is because core skills deal 135% increased damage, meaning our Whirlwind skill, our primary skill, is going to benefit from this and deal 135 increased damage. But it does cost 100% more Fury. This is a good trade-off because you're using double the Fury to get well over double the damage, and it speeds up the process of dealing damage to enemies, allowing you to deal higher DPS much, much faster. What you can do later if you want is use one of your primary attack spots or something like that to switch out Iron Skin. This way you can use Iron Skin to help protect you and regen some of that damage, and it absorbs 50% of your missing life for 5 seconds. Now let's really quickly go over the expertise section for the Barbarian, because a bunch of people don't realize this, and I didn't realize this until yesterday, but you can actually get the benefit from 2 separate weapon abilities, which is huge for damage, because essentially as a Barbarian you get the technique slot where you can slot in a technique to get the bonuses from that. Now these don't stack, so if you used a two-handed sword and you had a two-handed sword weapon expertise here, you would only get the 1 bonus. But here comes the trick. So if you're using a two-handed sword by default as your primary weapon just in your inventory, you get the bonuses for the two-handed sword, which gives you the bleeding damage effects, which are great for this build because we stack a lot of bleed damage on enemies. Now, if you're using a two-handed sword, you'll get that benefit. So then what we want to do is use the two-handed axe expertise, which gives us 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which our skill that we currently have already, we went through, makes enemies vulnerable, and you get that 10% increased critical strike chance against those enemies as well. So you're going to get the benefit from this additionally while you're using your two-handed sword. So additionally, whether you're using an axe or a sword, you want to put the technique slot of the one you're not using here, so you get those additional benefits as well as the weapon that you're currently using. You're going to want to be running a two-handed sword, and then you're going to want to use the two-handed axe expertise because of the benefits here to vulnerable enemies, which again, all of our gear at some point we want to have vulnerable damage on it because of the frequency that we make enemies vulnerable and the bonuses we get from that. So the 3 primary things you're going to want to look out for as a Barbarian aspect wise is the Bold Chieftain's resource aspect. This aspect makes it so whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1 to 1.9 seconds per nearby enemy, up to a maximum of 6 seconds. This is a huge skill to have because it allows you to have infinite uptime on your shouts. You cast it with enough enemies around, it goes completely back down and you can immediately cast it again if you want. This is the one aspect you need to pay attention for because it can only be found on legendary items and can only be extracted in order to have it to imprint on another item. It's not an actual aspect in the aspect menu, so again, the only way you can get it is from a random drop. So pay attention to make sure if you get this on something, you extract it to save it for later. Again, another primary aspect you have to have is aspect of the Dire Whirlwind. It gives you additional critical strike chance up to 3 to 9% depending on what your roll on the actual item is, but this can be multiplied to a much higher percentage. Now once you find items with these aspects, you should keep them because otherwise you're only going to get the lowest end possible aspect of using the base aspects in the aspect menu when enchanting gear. Now if you can see, I just found this piece not that long ago and it gives me this Whirlwind aspect for critical strike chance. It gives me increased by 14% up to 42% instead of 3 to 9%, right? So normally it would be 3%, instead I got 14%, or 9%, but here I have 42%. So I can take this aspect from this weapon and print it on another weapon and have insane damages. So make sure when you find these kind of weapons or this kind of stuff with these aspects on them that you want, you save the pieces so that way you can extract the aspects because they give you way more benefit than the regular aspects themselves. Again, another good aspect is the utility aspect of Grasping Whirlwind, which makes it so Whirlwind periodically pulls enemies to you. It just feels very great and allows for you to pull enemies in closer to kind of damage them more in a consistent fashion. Another really great aspect to have is Edge Master's aspect. This lets you deal up to 10% X increased damage based on your available primary resource when you cast. So essentially you're going to be getting the most benefit from this when you have max fury, meaning your skills deal extra damage the more fury you have. And with this rotation, we're going to be spending infinite amounts of fury and basically replenishing it constantly, allowing us to have this increased damage buff if you have it on your gear, which is very, very good. The third aspect, which is one you should definitely consider, is the aspect of Numbing Wrath. What this does makes it so that each point of fury generated while at maximum fury grants you 3 fortify. And since we're going to be at maximum fury a lot and hopefully most of the time, we should get a lot of fortify this way. And this is solid because fortify characters take 10% reduced damage and you become fortified when you have more fortify than your current life, allowing us to become fortified very, very quickly on higher level builds. Now these next two aspects are probably 2 of the 4 or 5 that I will mention are your primary aspects that you should have, and that's because this is very, very good and allows you for soloing a lot of different content. So aspect of the Protector. So having this aspect makes it so that damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier, and you absorb up to 750 damage for 10 seconds. This can only happen once every 30 seconds, but this is a great skill to have because this uses this barrier to give you a ton of protection, almost equivalent to your life at early stages in the game. Even at level 50, I think my HP is only like 1,000. So this gives you basically double the HP every time this is used every 30 seconds. Meaning every time you get into a fight, this is essentially going to activate, give you double the health, and it will keep you from dying very, very often. And finally, one of the better aspects overall aspect of berserk ripping is very, very powerful, and you should have this in your build 100%. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, you inflict 20% of the base damage dealt as additional bleed damage over 5 seconds. That means we're going to inflict 20% additional base damage as bleed damage on top of the bleed damage that we're already putting on enemies. Now additionally, I'm going to throw up these stat priorities on the screen to show you exactly what is good about this build and what you should be looking for. Now for anything that's weapon wise, these are what you're going to want to look out for. You're going to want to make sure you grab vulnerable damage as a stat first. That and critical strike damage is very, very important. Those are your two most important stats on weapons, as well as strength. And then the stats that you're going to get to help us do even more damage, which is going to be damage to close enemies, core skill damage, and damage to slowed enemies. And then once you get legendary items, you're going to want to stack royal emeralds on them because it's going to give you increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. It's going to give you thorns, and it's going to give you poison resistance. And then as far as gear, I'll just throw this up too. When you're looking for gear, you're going to want to look for specifically damage reduction against close enemies and things like that would make sense for a barbarian, as well as cooldown reduction, resource generation, bonuses to all your stats, and maximum life. And what you're going to want to socket on that equipment is going to be royal sapphires. This is going to give you 12% critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies, which will benefit us all the time. 3% damage reduction while fortified, which hopefully will be again all the time. Really quick, I'm going to go through the rotation with you just so you fully understand how to maximize kind of the DPS you're getting out of this build. Now, when playing on higher difficulties, your challenging shot is going to be your defensive skill to help get solid damage reduction. So if you don't have this up, you may have to play a little defensively. So you want to pay attention to when this is up so you can use it to stay alive. Basically, this rotation is going to be using all 3 shots at once when possible to get all of the buffs, and then using, when needed, the Wrath of the Berserker shout to give us increased damage and all that extra increase in buffs and everything else. And then we're going to be using Whirlwind with all of these shots active to output as much damage as possible. So as far as this rotation goes, we're essentially just going to run past a bunch of these enemies, use our defensive shout, use our other 2 shouts, and the 4th one if you would like, and then just kind of mow through these guys with our Whirlwind because it's going to infinitely regenerate itself. You can see I'm going to continue and I'm going to run past a bunch of these mobs, and then I'm going to cast our 3 shouts and use Whirlwind here to kind of just mow through most all of them. And then earlier on in levels, at some point you're going to have to figure out how to manage your fury regeneration before you start getting all your aspects and stuff involved. Now I plan on doing a full endgame build with the Barbarian and with full aspects, full legendary gear, everything. I'm just not there yet. I'm only level 47. That being said, if you guys enjoyed, drop a like and let me know in the comments if you're gonna try this build, or let me know if you're already running this build because it's very, very good. That being said, check out this video on the left or the right on Diablo 4.